Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Matt Helmer. I'm the Director of Job Quality and Worker Wellbeing at the Aspen Institute Economic Opportunities Program. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's conversation, Fixing Work, Recent Lessons from the Field. This conversation is part of our Job Quality and Practice series, in which we really try to surface and explore new and different ideas and strategies that organizations can use to address what we see as the biggest economic opportunity challenge we face, which is low job quality and the opportunity to fix work. Before we get started, just a quick review of our technology as we normally do for those joining us via Zoom, which is essentially everyone. All attendees are muted. Please use that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit and upvote questions. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Use the chat to share your perspective, your ideas, examples, resources related to your work and perspective. We'll have a survey at the very end of the event. It'll pop up in your browser. Please take a chance to do that. We always appreciate hearing your feedback and thoughts. If you want to post about this conversation on the social media platform of your choice, our hashtag is Talk Opportunity. If you do experience any technical issues that pop up during the event, you can email us at eop.program@aspeninstitute.org, or you can try to use the chat as well. We will be recording this event and we will share that via email as well as post it on our website here in the coming days. Finally, closed captions, are available for this discussion. Please just click that CC button at the bottom of your screen to activate them. So let's get started. I think most of you know who follow our work at the Economic Opportunities Program that we've had this increased emphasis and focus on improving work and workplaces and job quality, at least over the last 15 years or so. And that was long before COVID, where I think the public, at large finally started to recognize that we have some real systemic job quality challenges in our economy, where we have many workers doing a lot of important work that are foundational to our society, and they're still not getting by. They don't have a decent standard of living, low wages, insufficient benefits, you kind of name it, and we'll dive more into that. But that's the issue that we're really concerned about and really focused on in large part here at EOP. I think for the last 10 or 15 years, if you followed the work and writing of my colleague Maureen Conway, who's the executive director here, she started saying some time ago that we needed to shift focus away from fixing workers and start to focus more on fixing work. And I think today, when you look at rising inflation, potential disruptions from AI, societal and political division, a weakening safety net, persistent poverty, problems with labor law, like there's just a host of other issues that I think make this work even more important and more timely than ever. So we've been doing a lot of engagement in this work with practitioners on the ground, trying to learn what's working, what's not working, what are the challenges they're experiencing. From 2022 to 2024, we did some in-depth interviews with about 22 different organizations from across the country, from labor unions to worker centers to workforce development organizations and CDFIs and employee ownership organizations, among many others, to kind of better understand the context in which they operate, what motivates them to do their work, how do they relate to workers and businesses, and really how do they operationalize kind of their job quality strategy and tactics? Like, what is it that they do to try to influence job quality in their local, regional, or even national economy? So we've synthesized all that into a report that we released a few weeks ago. We called the report Fixing Work, Lessons from Job Quality Practitioners. It should be popping up there in your chat, hopefully here shortly. I encourage you to take a look. There's a lot of really great information in there about a range of things organizations are doing to address this crisis. I think one of the things that stands out to me though in this report and kind of the meat of the report really is the range of strategies and tactics that organizations use depending on their context, depending on their organizational assets, depending on their mission and history. There's just a lot of different ways organizations are trying to tackle this situation and contribute to improving job quality. Everything from research and policy advocacy to business advising and coaching to worker and community organizing to legal action. There's just a lot of different, I think we came up with about 11 or 12 different strategies that we saw organizations doing, and sometimes they blended those. But what brings all of these organizations together under kind of a common umbrella, I think, is this deep realization that the design and outcomes of our economy and of our jobs aren't inevitable. They aren't the work of some magic hand. When you look at the low quality jobs in our economy, whether that be, app-based delivery drivers, fast food workers, home care aides, farm workers, meat and poultry processing, the list goes on of workers who are suffering from insufficient wages, benefits, and poor working conditions. But behind all of that, there's no inevitability around it, right? These are all the result of choices that we make, choices that businesses make, choices that policymakers make, and choices that we as a society make around how we reward and value different work and different occupations and different people. Um, I think many of the low quality jobs that we see in our economy, they're not just relics of a society that has too often undervalued the work of women, people of color, immigrants, and sometimes people in rural communities. It's really, I think, an ongoing indictment that these issues of sexism, racism, and classism still very much are at the center of our economy and driving a lot of the issues that we see today. Um, but the good news is, and our speakers are going to share a little bit about what they do today, is that we can make different choices around this, right? We can choose to design an economy that looks different, one that promotes human dignity, inclusion and equity, and a decent standard of living for everyone. I think what we'll also hear today and what's also in the report, though, is that this work is not easy. There's a lot of challenges in ensuring every job can provide things such as a living wage and benefits. But having this North Star of a good jobs economy, where a good job becomes the standard rather than the exception, I think is the direction we want to go, and that's what the practitioners we're going to hear from today are working towards. Lastly, I'll say what's striking and important about the report that we put out, and I think the other thing that we've learned is that there are all sorts of ways organizations can contribute to creating good jobs, some of them big and some of them small in scale and scope, maybe, but all of them important. A lot of this work obviously stands on the shoulders of labor unions and the labor movements and their important contributions, and that's not going away, right? Their work remains as vital today as ever. But I think these times call on us all to do more and to pursue all the paths we have available to us to influence the quality of jobs that we have in our economy. That's going to require some important mind shifts, I think, in how we diagnose our economic troubles and how we diagnose things such as poverty, but also in how we respond to those. It's going to require more of us to step out of our comfort zones, to try new things, to partner with different types of organizations and institutions that maybe weren't on our radar or weren't a part of what we saw as our ecosystem. We're going to have to think about how we engage workers and businesses in new ways and in new conversations. And it's going to require time, right? This is what we call long-term systems change work. And, achieving some of those victories and wins can take years, if not decades sometimes. And it requires courage to recognize that what we have is broken, and that even all of us taking the tiniest step forward and recognizing that each of us have a role to play is important. And I think that's one of the lessons that you'll see in our report, and it's one of the lessons I think our speakers are going to share today is that there's plenty of opportunities, again, big and small, for us all to play a role in this work. We're so lucky to be joined today by this wonderful panel who I'm going to introduce in just a second. You all might notice in a minute that one of our speakers, Jody Sturgeon from PHI, had a personal matter come up at the very last moment. She's in our thoughts and prayers as she deals with that issue. And we'll hope to have Jody back at another time. When I think of job quality work, one of the first organizations that comes to mind for me is PHI because I think they've been at this for so many decades and have created so many important lessons learned and strategies in their work. So I encourage you to check them out more if you're not familiar with them. But we'll bring them back another time, like I said, and unpack a little bit of what they do. So let me introduce our great panel that we have today. We are going to end about 15 minutes early than expected at 3:15 Eastern rather than 3:30, just because we have a smaller panel, just as a note. But now it's my great pleasure to introduce you to these folks. So first we have Evan Edwards. He's CEO of Project Equity. And I encourage you to read their bios and learn a little bit more about their organizations. I'm just going to put faces to names right now so that we can jump into the conversation. So we have Evan, then we have Adam Kedar, who's the Public Policy Director of Arise Chicago. And finally, we have Renise Walker, Assistant Director of Systems Innovation at Colorado Workforce Development Council. And all of their organizations were interviewed as part of our report, so you'll see them mentioned in that report as well. So let's get started. And I'm going to ask each of our speakers maybe just to introduce yourself a little bit and your organization, maybe talk a little bit about why you think this work is so important right now, and then talk a little bit about how you think about defining job quality or defining a good job. Like, what does that mean for you? What does that mean in your context? And Renise, I think I'm going to start with you.
Thank you so much, Matt. Appreciate the opportunity to be here and to learn from Evan and Adam alongside me, but also just appreciate the Aspen Institute and you all's ongoing commitment to job quality and economic mobility. As you mentioned, my name is Renise Walker. I get to serve as the Assistant Director for Systems Innovation at the Colorado Workforce Development Council. So I think a lot about what can we do to make life better for Coloradans, specifically in the workforce space. And so as my role within the council itself is part of our state government. And it's a group that's been appointed by our governor. It's a public-private partnership of leaders that come from businesses, education, workforce development, economic development. And they're all tasked with coming together to think about how they can best advise, oversee, and integrate the work of talent development in our state. And so as we think about this from the council lens, a couple of things that I would lift up and why job quality is so important to us. One, we believe in a Colorado for all. Colorado is a state that is fortunate to have a pretty strong economy when you think about what's happening overall, but we know that not all demographics in our state fare equally well within our economy. And we think it's behooves us, it best serves the state, it best serves our local communities to really think about what we can do better so that everyone in the state can thrive and contribute to the quality of life that we have. And in that context, continuing to have a strong economy, continuing to be a place where people can really strive, it requires that people are connected to opportunity and that they are able to contribute in ways. But creating that opportunity requires that there are strong businesses to make it up. And so, especially as we think of this through a workforce lens, we spend a lot of time thinking about how do we get individuals trained? How do we make them more aware of the jobs that exist in the state? But I think that it's incumbent on us to also think about the other side of that equation, not just what's happening with individuals, but what's the context that they're going into? What are the available jobs? How are they finding their way into those jobs? And are the jobs really supporting their needs overall as individuals and helping to balance the rest of the needs of life? And so we really started the job quality conversation. It was pre-pandemic. And we had a strong, thriving economy, but employers continued to come to us and say, we need help. Like, we can't find workers. We're struggling to fill our open positions. And so as we looked at what are the businesses doing that are attracting and retaining workers? What are the businesses doing that are really thriving? And we noticed that those businesses, there were some consistent themes across how they really invested in their people, how they thought about people, not as just kind of a cost structure, but really how they thought about across the entire value stream, what they could do to better attract and retain those workers, how they could make sure that they were listening carefully to those workers and their ideas to make life better, and how they were offering safe environments. And so we had conversations with a number of our stakeholders throughout the state to ask them, when it comes to job quality, what do you think about? How do you define that? And what we learned is that job quality is very unique to each individual in each context, but there were a couple of key themes that were also consistent with how people were defining job quality nationally that we should lean into and that we should really focus on together. And so we published a job quality framework and defined job quality as kind of the characteristics of a job that meet the needs of an individual while also allowing the business to thrive, just out of recognition that this is an equation. And if you skew too far on either end of that equation, you really do give up either quality of life and well-being for individuals, which causes burnout, it causes stress, and undermines kind of the quality of your business. And the opposite of that is true as well. If you're only focused on what the business needs, if you're only focused on profitability, that will cause problems as well and lead to a lack of sustainability. And so we really look at this kind of from an intersectional lens and really do believe that we all have a role to play in making sure that the jobs in the state are quality and helping to connect people to them.
So much, Renise. Evan, let's turn to you next. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you think about job quality and its intersection with employee ownership.
Yeah, happy to. And before I start, I just want to thank you again, Matt and Maureen and the entire team at the Aspen Institute for the opportunity to be here. Um, I'm Evan Edwards. I'm CEO at Project Equity. We are a national nonprofit organization with a twofold mission. We work to close the wealth gap by transitioning business ownership from legacy owners to ownership by their workforce. Typically, we're utilizing three primary models of employee ownership. I won't get into that nuance right now. And in doing so, we foster economic resiliency, we create pathways to prosperity for those workers, and we refer to this as our deep impact work. The second part of our mission is to bring employee ownership to normalization and scale within the national business ecosystem. And we do this such that workers are regularly becoming shareholders and owners of the businesses within the normal course of M&A activity. In other words, we know that there's 80,000 businesses that change hands that are listed for sale in a given year. We want to see that a representative number, and I like to generally say 3 in 10 of those businesses that transact every year are transacting into some form of employee ownership or shareholder representation. This work is important because economic inequity, at the rate we're seeing it, is at a very basic level unjust. And at the levels we're currently seeing it, it's inhumane. And in the long run, it's corrosive to society and it's unsustainable for a productive economy. Uh, with that as the backdrop, we're defining quality jobs as those that provide workers with above livable wages, access to profit sharing, benefits, dependable work schedules, and ideally voice and a role in governance. And all of this accrues to a sense of agency.
I love that, Evan. Thanks so much. Adam, let's turn to you.
Hello, I'm Adam Kedar. I'm the Public Policy Director for Arise Chicago, and also want to begin by thanking Matt and the rest of the Aspen team for inviting me to participate and to talk about some of the work that Arise Chicago does. Our mission is to organize the collective power of working class immigrants in partnership with faith communities to uplift all workers. And immigrant workers, primarily women, primarily low wage, primarily immigrant, are the heart of our organization. And workers that are facing difficulties on the job, in some cases extreme forms of oppression and exploitation, join our organization as members. And one of the reasons I love Arise Chicago is because we're a true center of community where people, as members of our organization, really do learn leadership and are get equipped with tools to make their lives better in the workplace and beyond. Our members are seeking power on the job to raise wages and to gain benefits, to eliminate health and safety hazards, to create respectful work environments that are free from discrimination, and to have manageable schedules that permit them to have meaningful lives outside of their work lives. And the question for, why is this work important now? The first thing I think of is a quote, an old saying that I like in the labor movement, that there's no such thing as undignified work. There are only undignified working conditions. And so one of the first big campaigns that I worked on at Arise Chicago was a candy factory in which workers were seldom allowed to leave their assembly line to use the bathroom. Bathroom breaks were so few and far between that some workers resorted to wearing diapers on the job. I want everyone to pause for just a moment and think about that. Wearing diapers on the job because your employer did not allow sufficient bathroom breaks. Work is what sustains ourselves and our families. And so I don't think there's anything undignified about working to sustain our lives. But too often, far too often, as Evan was saying, working conditions are undignified, even inhumane. And when I think about job equality, also, when we think historically, a long time ago, steel mills were among the least desirable, most dangerous jobs that you can think of, right? Child labor, dirty, horribly dirty and disease-ridden work sites. But because workers organized unions, they were able to transform steel jobs into desirable middle-class, sustaining jobs, including for workers without education or other traditional, measurements of workforce development. But if we fast forward a century later, we continue to mourn the loss of jobs like those manufacturing jobs. What once were terrible jobs when they arrived are now ones that we mourn their disappearance. So for me, taking the long view, there's no reason to settle for thinking that today's terrible jobs should always remain so. We know that through worker organizing, we will transform today's terrible jobs into tomorrow's desirable ones. And I think that the work is so important right now because the economic well-being of workers in this country continues to decline, as my co-panelists have already mentioned. And that furthermore, this is really work is the determining factor for so much other facets of our lives. What happens in the workplace has such a profound impact on our well-being at home, in our communities, among our families. And so I think that for those reasons, we really need to show our concern and come up with solutions now. And a lot of us are concerned about creeping authoritarianism in our society. And I think that we should reckon with the fact that some of these conditions that we talk about, this really poor quality in our work sites, comes down to a form of authoritarianism in our workplaces. So coming to really address job quality head on, we think that job quality at Arise Chicago is fundamentally democracy in the workplace. That means that voice and dignity and power for workers at work. That job quality is workers actively deciding the terms and conditions of their workplaces. And while we can talk about and should talk about universal standards and categories for looking at job quality, like Renise said, job quality will mean different things to different people in different work sites. And so that's why I think the concept of workplace democracy really speaks to the heart of addressing job quality, because if we have a voice on the job and the power to make decisions on the job, I think that's an assurance of how we can reach higher job quality. And I think that it's hard, as I said, because of this impact of the workplace and the rest of society. It's hard to talk about civic democracy and workplace democracy as two separate things. And that's why I kind of urge us when we enter these conversations to really embrace the idea of democracy both in and outside of workplaces, because it's really hard to have one without the other.
I love that, Adam. I love the connection too between job quality and quality of life, because I think that is the core of the issue in some respects, but you've even taken it a step further, right? And it's not just that low quality jobs affect our personal well-being and our family well-being, but it affects our national well-being, right? And I think we can tease that a little bit more apart here too as we go. So you've heard from kind of three of our three panelists about kind of bigger picture vision and goals for this work. But as I noted kind of early on in my remarks up front, there's a range of different strategies at our disposal for thinking about how we engage in this job quality work. And I think very often what we see here at Aspen is that organizations that are doing job quality work is they're often sitting at this important intersection of policy and practice, right? And their strategies are often dealing with both of those things, right? And policies informing practice and practices informing policy. So I want us to unpack that a little bit and see what that looks like from each of your perspectives as we dive into kind of this next part of the discussion. And maybe Adam, I'll just stick with you here for a second, because Arise is positioned at a number of important intersections, driving both this policy change, but also supporting workers in organizing and in campaigns to improve their workplaces and often to unionize. So give us a sense of how all of this kind of comes together at Arise and the collaborations that are important in your work with labor and faith-based organizations and government.
Thanks. And that's right. Arise Chicago is situated at a number of intersections. I think, again, looking historically, labor unions, traditionally have been the defining power for workers in this country. And, for such a long time, we're able to raise standards across entire industries through their collective bargaining agreements with employers all over. And in places like Europe, historically, it's been the government that's been able to govern workplaces through sweeping, wide-ranging legislation. But I think we find ourselves in contemporary America where we really do need to patch together a variety of interventions and collaborations to tackle this problem of job quality. As we've already mentioned, it's dangerously pervasive and out of control, the lack of job quality. And so, for Rise Chicago, what that typically means is that we're educating workers about their rights. We're finding out what changes they need to see happen in order for them to attain job quality at work. And then we assist them to design winning strategies to achieve it. So some of those strategies, involve our partners that you mentioned, because we're typically blending forms of direct action, legal action, and government action. And for those that don't know, for us, direct action looks like workers collectively approaching their employer and demanding changes. In our experience, employers seldom respond to those approaches of workers, simply bringing forth, ideas and demands for change. And so we will assist workers to escalate their actions to things like stopping work production. So to stick with that candy factory that I mentioned at the beginning, the workers did not win bathroom breaks after approaching their employer multiple times. They didn't win the bathroom breaks until they coordinated a work stoppage that forced their employer to reckon with the problem and negotiate. Similarly, during the pandemic, when workers were denied personal protective equipment, when they weren't given information about coworkers who had been infected, other major crises like these, Rise Chicago assisted workers to do what we called health strikes, ceasing walking off the job, until safety measures were put in place. In some cases, literally life-saving measures. Legal action, probably everyone is familiar with, is that means that we're helping connect our members to private attorneys who can bring employers to court who have refused to listen to or respond to their workers' concerns. And government action, means partnering with labor enforcement agencies like Chicago's Office for Labor Standards, in order to reach what some people call so-called hard-to-reach workers, to make sure that we're upholding legal rights in the workplaces. In the instance of Chicago, things like our local minimum wage, our fair scheduling law, paid sick days, and paid time off days. So while workers lead these efforts, we have lots of forms of support for them. We focus on organizing congregations across many different faith traditions who understand the sanctity of workers' rights, since workers' rights are human rights, and who are able to raise the moral voice and accompany workers when they take those actions. We also rely on immigrant rights organizations who understand that the workplace is a critical front for the fight for immigrant rights, and they understands that attacks on immigrant workers undermine the well-being and, yes, the job equality also of all American workers. And so those are sort of the ways in which we weave together these different approaches. We're a small community organization, and so we do rely on this, a network and a variety of strategies to tackle this problem.
Great. Thanks, Adam. I may come back and ask you to elaborate on a few of those a bit more. Evan, let me come back to you for a second. I've known Project Equity for a while and have the highest respect for you all. You're really a national thought leader in employee ownership. You produce research, you engage in policy advocacy, you help build public awareness, you train field practitioners, and of course, as you mentioned, you're also kind of on the ground supporting businesses in their conversion to employee ownership. So talk to us a bit about kind of the core activities of Project Equity and how they kind of complement each other and what that looks like.
Sure, happy to. I will start with the core work of transitioning businesses, what I identified in my opening comments as our deep impact work. We take an approach to our work that has us engaging in all aspects of transitioning businesses to employee ownership. So we do the work to build a pipeline of businesses with workforces that are representative of workers that meet our impact objectives. We provide consultations to business owners and their advisors, educating them on why an employee ownership transition may be a fit for their business, excuse me. Then we do the due diligence and the technical assistance work to transition ownership, and then utilizing our capital and additional financing from partners, we essentially buy the business from the legacy owner for the workforce. And then the business is going forward cash flow services the debt to satisfy the transaction. But we understand that while our efforts are impactful, in order for us to build the pipeline, in order for us to normalize and drive scale, there are other activities we have to pursue. So we engage with local government, both economic development folks and policy folks, to influence them and to build incentives at the local level for employee ownership, right? We teach economic development folks how it is to identify businesses that, quite frankly, are good transition opportunities, what businesses we call succession ready. Similarly, we look at the local policy landscape and see what alternatives, what levers might be available to drive and incentivize employee ownership. We harvest our expertise through our work in order to educate business advisors and other folks who are first touch with business owners around employee ownership. And we do this through learning content that we've created that I'm very proud to say we've also gotten accredited, so that now we've aligned incentives such that these advisors, when they're engaging with their business owner clients, they're now able to recommend an employee ownership transition, employee ownership as a transition succession strategy or a workforce engagement strategy, right? We learned a lot during the pandemic that business owners really struggled to retain and engage their workers, and lo and behold, imagine providing equity ownership keeps your employees engaged and retains them. So our work is really about, again, twofold: doing that impact work, actually transitioning businesses, getting equity into the hands of workers. But everything that we do along the way, from the awareness building to develop pipeline, to all of the technical work, to raising capital, to fund transactions, to engaging with advisors in other parts of the ecosystem, we actually harvest all of that experience and knowledge, and then we export it out to the more traditional business ecosystem. And again, those other stakeholders like policy folks, those in higher ed, et cetera, all with the intention that, again, employee ownership begins to happen through the course of normal business activity.
Great. Thanks, Evan. I'm going to come back to you to explain a little bit more of that in a second, too. Renise, I think you, in some of your opening remarks, you had stated that when people think of workforce development, they often think of just training and education. And I think that's shifted in large part in recent years for the better to be more inclusive of things that are more kind of in this job quality strategy realm. But I wonder if you could talk to us a bit about more about what the Workforce Development Council is doing, and kind of the evolution of your job quality work and how you're putting it into practice with your partners.
Yeah, absolutely. Matt, maybe I'll just start with a little bit about what we're required to do. Sometimes where there can be confusion is for us at the council, as a state workforce board or local workforce development boards, can be some of the best kept secrets in many communities. So just a word about those boards. There's a federal law called the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and it directs states, local governments to do a couple of different activities. So boards are tasked with connecting employers with skilled talent, helping workers acquire skilled for workforce opportunities, identifying labor market trends, partnering on economic development resources, because workforce development is critical to economic development in all of our communities, and then manage a plan that can help direct resources, public resources and otherwise, to establish funding priorities to help get people connected to work. So as we think about what we're required to do, it helped to prompt a number of questions about, if that's the floor, how can we really go above and beyond that to really make sure that both our workers, our learners, and our employers in the state are getting what they need? And so one of the ways that we looked at that is, like, how do we turn the mirror on ourselves? Our governor, Governor Jared Polis, is really invested in thinking about the state as a model employer. In many communities in Colorado and across the nation, your workforce boards, think your colleges, community colleges, or higher education institutions can be some of the larger employers in the community. And with that comes a real opportunity, a real responsibility to think about, what are we doing for our own workers? How are we helping to model and practice things that we want to see and influence in private sector employment? So with that, our governor issued a number of executive orders to really think about, how does the state start to look at our hiring practices? Can we really invest in skills-based hiring to remove some of the kind of focusing just on credentials that are needed, and really examine where are those actually needed and where are they actually just serving as a barrier to prevent people from accessing state jobs? And when they're serving as a barrier, get them out of the way. Let's remove them from the job descriptions. But also, let's look at how we're investing in our workers. Let's launch more apprenticeships, launch more work-based learning opportunities to increase awareness and exposure to state jobs, but also give opportunity to be training while they're earning money, so not having to stop out to get that additional training, and using those earn and learn models to help people to move up. Our governor has also been really invested in employee ownership and thinking about how we can kind of raise awareness, encourage opportunities for different leaders throughout the state, or different employers throughout the state, to think about transitions to different models of employee ownership. And so that's one way that I think has been an important lever in kind of practicing what we preach. How do we adopt those practices and what we are able to control as state government, and having that hiring power in what we do for our own workers? The other way is, what do we influence? Governments have a lot of roles they can play in advancing job quality. Policy is one way, and you can think about that as incentives, carrots to grow job quality. You can also think about it as sticks. For us, with the council, we really wanted to think about, how do we better understand what the needs of employers were to increase their job quality? So playing a real role in releasing a framework for action to give people a basis of, like, what is job quality? What is some shared language, some shared practices that we can adopt to increase the supply of jobs within our state that are good jobs on the different domains that we talked about earlier? But then going from that framework and really thinking about, how do we start to attach it to data? One of the ways that our office helps to support what happens in the state is we release an annual report called the Talent Pipeline Report. It is a report for our legislature to really draw attention to matters of importance in the workforce space. And so lifting up, what is the supply of jobs in our state? Which ones are providing kind of life-sustaining wages for families and individuals? Which ones are not? Where are there opportunities to really focus on emphasizing job quality? Again, to start to raise urgency and direct more clear action to where there are opportunities to make some real transitions in our economy. At the local level, the boards are also playing a helpful role in just educating employers. How is what you're doing as a firm comparing to your competitors? Are you paying competitive wages? Do you have some safety issues that you might want to take a look at? Really addressing, really hearing from workers, because you are losing workers constantly to your competitors because of some of these issues. And so we have worked to really build capacity of our local boards, our local workforce centers, to be that center to help provide that type of education for employers, to help identify what are free, low-cost ways that an employer can get started in improving their job quality, and then continue to move up along a continuum, so that everybody really does see themselves in their role in improving job quality. And then we've also thought about how do we integrate it into the ways that we issue grants, the ways that we push funding out into our community. Just one example of that with our stimulus dollars after COVID-19 was happening, we were thinking about what was needed for our economic recovery and where we would go from there. And so we released a round of grants that incentivize trade associations to gather with other employers in their industry to really identify what are opportunities that they can take on based on their needs in their industry that can help to improve job quality, that could really look at racial equity and where there were some really opportunities that were getting overlooked to improve their own practices to advance that. There are some people that met that with a lot of excitement. There were some people that were like, we don't have a role with that. We just want to do some training or otherwise to improve this economic recovery. But at that end of that grant cycle, a lot of people were really grateful for the insights that they learned. And as an example, I think some of our hospitality leaders were thinking, we're really good at diversity. We have lots of people from lots of different backgrounds working in our jobs, but it helped them to identify where there were opportunities to not just look at who they were bringing in the door, but how they were thinking about promotion and advancement and make some different choices along those lines. And so I think it's really for us looking at what are the things that are under our control, where do we get started, and how do we use those levers to help to improve the supply of good jobs in our state?
Great. Thanks, Renise. Well, I heard in all three of your comments this issue of like these issues of engaging workers and engaging businesses. I want to come back to you and talk about some lessons learned in this next section of the discussion. But before I do that, I want to throw in a few pre-submitted audience questions here, and whomever wants to take them can take them. One was, what do you all see as the role of local government in supporting good jobs or job quality? And I know from your remarks just now, a number of you are partnering with local government, so maybe you could talk a little bit more about that. And similarly, another pre-submitted question from the audience was, what do you see the role of universities and colleges in supporting job quality? And Evan, I know you've done some work with Morehouse in the South, so maybe you could talk about that. But let's talk about this first question, just around what the role of local government is and how you all work with them.
Sure,
Adam, go ahead.
I'd be happy to chime in. As I mentioned, we found early in our work that it was really important to engage at the economic development level, that those folks in those roles have visibility of their local economy and of the businesses in those economy. And oftentimes they are engaging strategies that we see as sort of race to the bottom strategies insofar as either retaining or attracting businesses. And we did some data analysis that basically lifted that legacy businesses, so those typically operating 20, 25 years and longer in a locality, typically employ 1 in 3 workers and accrue to 2/3 of economic activity. So we did these data studies and brought them forward to economic development leaders in some of our early partner localities. So Berkeley, San Francisco, then with some diversity of communities in mind, Tucson, Arizona, Miami, Florida. I could go on. And we help them to understand that it's far more valuable to invest in retention of businesses in your local economy than it is to try to attract those from others or other strategies, incubators, which are valuable, but don't necessarily meet the mark. And employee ownership actually is really effective at keeping businesses in local economies, keeping communities stable. And so local government now sees an appeal in employee ownership that they hadn't before, just because they did not understand the impact of legacy businesses on their economy. So it's really important in this work that we do the lift of helping those folks that are both policymakers and in the practice at the economic development level to understand how employee ownership serves as a strategy to engage local businesses, keep them in place.
Great. Thanks, Evan. Adam, you have some different kind of relationships and partnerships you do with City of Chicago. I wonder if you want to talk about that and kind of what you see as the role of local government via that.
Thanks, I'd be glad to. Obviously being a local community organization, we do see local government as a major part of the solution and a major partner in job equality efforts. And I do think there are some inherent advantages to working with local government. Obviously there's such dramatic swings in administrations at higher levels of government, certainly at the federal level. There's a certain level of continuity at the local government level that I think lends itself to the sort of longer term, slow burning, critical kind of interventions that we're talking about. There's a sense that you can build momentum. We actually think that a lot of more innovative labor policy or policies that uphold labor standards, increase job equality. We think that really there's a lot of flexibility and experimentation that can occur at the local level. And I think back, I think a really good example, I mentioned our Office of Labor Standards. That's actually a campaign that arrived in Chicago. It was really played a pivotal role for passing an ordinance that allowed the city of Chicago to have its own sort of essentially labor department. And for us, having a local labor enforcement agency is a major part of upholding job equality, as I was saying before. And we based that on a couple experiments at the time when we passed that ordinance. San Francisco, Seattle, and New York were the three cities that had really paved the way for that. And by networking with these other cities, we were able really to look at how can we design from the ground up a modern labor enforcement agency that meets the needs of the community, the way the community is comprised today, the way the economy is comprised today. And I think that's been a tremendously successful experiment in looking at a new kind of labor agency, given that cities historically weren't in the business of regulating business in that way, right? And so the partnership we've done with the Office of Labor Standards, I would highlight as a really successful example of what some observers are now calling co-enforcement, which is not exactly the way it sounds necessarily. Certainly we're not deputized to enforce employment laws or anything, but what it gets to, the heart of the matter is that workers on their own aren't going to discover their rights. There's really no place in which we as workers learn about our rights, certainly local laws as well. It's not something that's taught in civics class. It's not something that we gain through other means. And so really partnering with an agency like the Office of Labor Standards, we're able to make sure that workers do understand their rights, understand that there is an agency dedicated to their well-being, and assisting the government also to reach further into communities that are overlooked or otherwise marginalized. So I think co-enforcement is really about the community helping direct priorities of a local government's enforcement efforts, outreach efforts, education efforts.
Thanks, Adam. Renise, did you want to jump in there?
Just happy to build on some of those comments. I talked a little bit about workforce boards, and many of those are appointed by local elected officials or county governments. But just to build on what Evan was saying earlier, I think local economic development plays an important role too. When you think about a community really giving voice to what they want from their jobs, the types of services and value add that they want from businesses, influencing economic development plans and economic development strategies can be a way to influence that. And so for us early on, we saw economic developers as a critical partner in this work, and really thinking about the economic development incentives that local governments were putting out there to attract new businesses, to retain, to grow existing businesses was really critical. And I would say the other way that we really worked with local governments is because in a state like Colorado, we have so much local economic diversity. As an example, there was a report run a few years ago that just identified archetypes of different cities throughout the country. Colorado was the only state with all 9 archetypes to exist within our borders. And so very early on, as we were releasing a job quality framework, our local communities told us that you can't set standards in Denver and expect that those same standards can be applied in rural communities or smaller communities, because the conditions are just very different. And so I think that's a place where local governments, local work is really critical to understand the context, what is happening there locally, what should be expected across the board, how can you work together with local partners to make sure that you're uplifting those standards and incentivizing those standards to ensure that everyone in your community is getting access to the same types of opportunities.
Great. Second part of that question was related to what people see as the role of like four-year colleges and universities. I think in our research, we often saw job quality practitioners partnering a lot with universities on doing some research that would maybe, put a spotlight on and help illuminate, some of the job quality challenges that the practitioner organizations were trying to lift up and grow awareness around. But curious to hear from any of you about partnerships with universities or colleges, or what you see as the role there in kind of in helping support job quality work.
Yeah, so Matt, you mentioned our partnership with Morehouse College in Atlanta, um, and the impetus for that partnership was actually our effort to lift up employee ownership as a Black wealth building strategy. Um, some of the lessons we learned in engaging higher ed and understanding the sort of different spheres of influence at those anchor institutions is that um, there's both through curriculum where employee ownership um, can be disseminated, but there's also uh, a number of programs that exist on college campuses and uh, community-facing organizations that are housed on campus, like SBDCs and the like. So that initial engagement uh, informed for us that we could actually bring employee ownership to other campuses, that it's not going to necessarily look the same across campuses. But one of the things that we learned um, relative to our work, it's really interesting, is that, I think we all in college learned about stuff that we don't necessarily put to work in our professional lives every day, but we became comfortable with certain concepts and ideas and the like. And so, we look for different ways to introduce employee ownership, whether it be very specifically working with a professor to help develop some curriculum, or through programmatic work or workshops. We happen to be participating in an employee ownership summit at Morehouse this November, which is modeled after the employee ownership summits that Project Equity has on an annual basis. But all of these are just communication and awareness tools that allow us to bring employee ownership forward. Then, as we have developed our professional curriculum that I mentioned earlier, that's intended for CPAs and other advisors, we're finding ways to repurpose that curriculum so that it can be included in other curriculum at different campuses. And we have a handful of different institutions that we're having discussions about working with. Really excited about that work, as we think that, as part of our effort to normalize employee ownership, is having the opportunity to spend time with young folks and getting their heads into the work, I think is going to be really powerful down the road for us.
Agreed. Thanks, Evan.
I would say really briefly, again, as a community organization, we've looked to and benefited from universities in a number of ways, actually, for our work. I think, helping us to define problems. So, anecdotally, we see trends that workers are bringing forth and talking about, and universities have been helpful in both legitimizing the claims that, workers are making by saying this is important, this matters, and defining that problem. And I think, a great example, it's a bit of an old one now, but, we and other, practitioners and activists, talked about wage theft, started using that phrase wage theft instead of non-payment of wages. There were a few landmark studies that really helped establish that, an understanding of the problem, defining the problem, legitimizing the claims. University of Illinois at Chicago, the Center for Urban Economic Development was part of that landmark national study. I think that universities have also helped us document the important work and progress and victories that groups like ours have done. That's been helpful in influencing decision makers who look to research in that way. Similarly, that have shared best practices. So I mentioned our work with Office of Labor Standards. I know the Rutgers University Workplace Justice Lab has been a champion of looking at practices such as those and helped connect the different cities looking to do similar things. So I do think that universities are part of that bigger ecosystem, in the fight for better working conditions and higher job quality.
I love the examples that each of you just shared, and I would just double down on what I briefly mentioned previously. Universities looking at their own jobs, their own sources of employment. As an example, I was invited to serve on an advisory board of one of our major universities. And there's a gentleman there who's running an initiative to really look at their facilities management work staff. It is a workforce that is made up highly of immigrant populations, largely people of color, that are supporting many of the needs of the university. And many of the universities, not just this one in the state of Colorado, need those workers to continue carrying out their business. And so he's really wanting to focus on how do we better help to make the skills that those individuals have visible? How do we help to better communicate what those skills are so that there are clearer pathways for those individuals to move up, maybe stay in other positions within kind of university employment or state government? And so I think it's just a really interesting and important way that universities can use their own positions within their communities and the larger community to really help to influence job quality practices.
Agreed. And similar to what you were saying, Evan, or building on what you were saying, I think there's real opportunity in thinking about our business schools and what they're teaching students, right? There's not only an opportunity for those business programs to be more inclusive of different models like employee ownership, but I think the work of Zainab Tom at MIT, who wrote the Good Jobs Strategy, which she has really been arguing, and she herself is a business professor, has really been arguing that good jobs can be an operational strategy, right? That is not only good for workers, but they can drive business performance. And I think too often in our business schools, what often gets taught or conveyed is that, in the words of Zainab again, is that, labor and workers are treated as this cost to be minimized rather than an asset to be maximized, right? So I think there's definitely a long road to go on that front, but some more opportunities building on what you were saying, Evan.
I'll offer
Go.
Matt real quickly that,
Sure.
and this is anecdotal, but it's broadly anecdotal that some of the experiences that I and others on our team are having is that college age folks, maybe less so in business school per se, are much more amenable to shared ownership models than maybe prior generations were. Um, I think that the hero entrepreneur, it has less currency maybe with this generation than with others. And again, that's an anecdotal observation, but I feel like one, given other characteristics of current generations, bodes well for shared ownership models as we go forward. Thanks for
Agreed.
letting me make that point.
I want to talk a little bit about what progress and success looks like, right? I think sometimes when a big victory happens on work or workers' rights, it seems to come out of nowhere and it's happened very quickly. But I think in reality, most of us knows those victories and that progress is, like I said earlier, is often the result of years, if not decades, of work, and that this work is really kind of long-term systems change oriented. So I'd like you all to maybe talk a little bit about an important win you've had, and maybe a bit about how that informs the work you have ahead of you and how you think about impact and progress and capturing that along the way. So maybe Evan, I'll start with you. There's a lot of energy around employee ownership right now, but I think progress can also be slow due to some of the complexity of the work at times. how do you think about at Project Equity, kind of measuring impact and progress, and what's something new and promising you're working on here coming soon?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. So, I'd say in terms of measuring progress, there's data and there's vibes, right? Um, we measure our impact by collecting data that's reflective of the number of business ecosystem partners we engage, the number of businesses we provide consultations to, the number of worker owners that we create, um, the amount of profit sharing dollars that are distributed to those workers. We also have data around, visits to our website and consumption of our learning products and views of our content and at our social media channels. You know, all of this accrues to, I'd say, progress in awareness and impact, but I don't think it tells the entire story. When I started in the EO field, the employee ownership field 8 years ago, there was little knowledge of the silver tsunami, that the phenomenon of, baby boomer business owners beginning to age out. Um, and there were few professionals that really knew about employee ownership, save some incorrect notions around ESOPs, right? So, fast forward to today, and the vibes have shifted monumentally. I engage owners and advisors and M&A professionals just about daily, and the awareness of employee ownership and the predisposition to it as a relevant business strategy is light years from where it was years ago. And so, again, there is the data that we collect that definitively shows progress. But then there are also those interactions that I'm having where I'm not nearly having the lift in bringing people over to the concept of employee ownership. So I see those as wins. Um, at Project Equity, we pride ourselves on being innovative and seeking new ways to bring this work forward. Um, we're working on a couple of exciting things right now. We've learned through our work that not every business owner that's interested in employee ownership is necessarily amenable to a transaction to the three prevalent models, the ESOP, the co-op, or the employee ownership trust. So we're innovating around new business models for making workers owners and shareholders in businesses broad-based ownership, that maybe aren't inclusive of those three models, just to provide another option for building wealth for workers through employee ownership. We're also very proud to be partnered with a technology startup called Zolidar that has developed an AI-powered platform that helps facilitate EO transactions. So we are pairing our learning products with this platform so as to activate business advisors in the process of consulting to their business owner clients, and also to drive scalability of transactions. So we're very, very excited about both of these areas of innovation in our work, and I look forward to sharing more about them in the future.
That's great, Evan. I'm excited about that too. Renise, you talked a little bit about, the power of data and stories and just simply providing benchmarks to local employers around like things like wages and how they stack up compared to their peers earlier in the conversation. I'm wondering, is there a story that stands out to you about kind of the impact and potential of your work in that area? And could you talk a little bit more about where that's headed?
One of the things that I'm just really excited about is how kind of the prevalence of conversations about job quality have grown in the state over time. I think there's still a lot of work that we need to do, but the fact that it is more of a conversation that's top of mind for more people is really important. And so within that, really lifting up the stories of what's working, where are we seeing momentum. There was a conversation I was having just a few weeks ago with our airport. The Denver International Airport is the sixth busiest airport internationally. And they bring together a number of employers. The airport is an employer themselves, but they work with lots of contract businesses. And so I had engaged with some of their staff previously to talk about apprenticeships and getting apprenticeships off the ground. And their investment has really grown from there. And so they were sharing that they have been kind of coordinating across the many employers at the airport to recognize that childcare is a real barrier for all of the people who come to work at the airport, and they needed to do something to solve that. And so they are working collaboratively as employers to really establish a childcare solution on site and really think about how they can collectively invest in one of the critical shortages and critical needs for all jobs to move forward. And so I think it's really in how do we promote more opportunities like that, not just the highlights of it and the exciting like headline that it's happening, but how did they get there? What did they really use to get started? How did they help to move forward to really inspire more businesses to think about the steps that they can take to improve job quality? And so I think that's a lot of where we're focused on the communications front, is continuing to lift up those stories, but lifting them up at a more detailed level. The other thing that we're looking at is just how do we really grow our data sophistication? I mentioned that we've looked at kind of assessing our labor market based on wages as one of the metrics of job quality, but we know that job quality is so much more than just wages. So how are there ways where we can better assess and measure the different activities that employers are taking to improve job quality, to better compare if you choose firm A to work at over firm B, what might expected outcomes be for you, and including that information into tools for job seekers so that they can make more informed decisions about where they would want to work, where they go for training, based on the whole picture of what that job would offer them, and not just the wages that many people think top of mind when they're applying for jobs.
Wow. I love both of what you and Evan are saying around the importance of communications and narrative, because I think that goes back to the kind of the societal mind shift we need to have, right? In some respects of moving away from some of the harmful narratives that we've had around everyone just needs to like pull yourself up by your bootstraps towards a narrative where everyone gets treated with dignity and respect, right? Adam, I think from talking to you last week or the week before, it seems like some of the workers that you've been working with have an important vote coming up tomorrow, which says to me that, kind of in spite of all the chaos and things that I think are working against job quality in some respects that are coming out of DC, that very much there's hope and change kind of happening on the ground that's alive in this work. So I wonder if you wanted to tell us a little bit about the story of those workers and what it means in this moment and any lessons we can take away from that.
Yes, thanks for that. Yeah, and no doubts, with the current administration, there are such strong forces against workers, against immigrants, against so many other people and things that we care about. But I think I'd like to remind ourselves that even in the most favorable political climate, worker struggles for justice are incredibly difficult. And, not to minimize what we're up against now, but, again, under more favorable conditions, it's so incredibly difficult. So, as you mentioned, yeah, we do have some of our members who work at a construction material factory. They develop different kinds of construction materials, are voting in a union election. And this has been over a year in the works, in which this workforce of around 130 workers repeatedly appealed to their employer directly on their own, asking for changes, particularly around major safety hazards. This is a very tragic work environment where multiple workers have broken limbs. I spoke to a worker just a few weeks ago. I had a chance to meet on the picket line who had broken his arm due to the machinery at work. Sadly, there have been amputations, including some workers who have lost fingers due to faulty machinery. And there was not one but two fires that occurred in this workplace. So, we talk about job quality, and I'm glad we're talking about job quality, but it's almost like we need a different word to describe, what a workplace like this, the lack of job quality, how intense that is there. And despite, like I said, repeated attempts by signing letters together, doing a delegation to the employer, having local elected officials sent a letter to the company, asking for changes to be made, did not see progress. which led the workers to seek, to unionize. And like I say, the vote is tomorrow. We, look forward to a victory. And for me, at least, I think, one of the biggest lessons to draw is that, as I said, it's always hard to imagine transforming your work environment. And I don't think it's that hyperbolic sometimes to describe workplace power dynamics as authoritarian. I know that some people have talked about you check your civil rights at the door when you enter a workplace. We live in a democracy, but many of the things that we take for granted outside the workplace are not permitted inside the workplace. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, a lot of those are curtailed. But despite all of that, I think that when we can see examples, inspiring examples of people changing things, that inspires so many other people to do so. I think it's really hard for a group of workers to imagine a different kind of workplace environment if they've worked even for a short amount of time, but especially for people who've worked all their lives under a certain set of conditions. It's really hard to imagine things changing until you see an example, like what we hope tomorrow will be, a strong example for people to see, to show that the boss isn't unbeatable, and that we won't fall for anti-immigrant rhetoric and won't let it divide us in our diverse workplaces. And I think it shows the power of solidarity, that when we show up for others, it actually emboldens us to fight for ourselves even more, because we now have the knowledge that the others that we showed up for are going to show up for us when we really need them to. So, I think that, yes, it's a relatively small work site. Yes, it's an isolated, campaign in some regards. And yet the potential power that this campaign can unleash for so many other people is one of inspiration, to reevaluate their own worth, their own value, to reevaluate what they're willing to put up with in a job, and really to be willing to for themselves define what job quality means to them.
Agree. That's great. We only have about a couple minutes left. And I want to try to synthesize maybe a few more audience questions into one final question where you each get maybe 45 or 60 seconds here. I think just as job quality organizations often sit between policy and practice, they often sit between workers and businesses, right? And some sit closer to businesses and some sit closer to workers, right? But regardless, that the engagement with businesses and the engagement and listening to workers is really foundational to a lot of this job quality work. So Evan and Renise, I wonder in the last 60 seconds if you could share a little bit about lessons learned or tips you have around engaging businesses in this job quality conversation or in this employee ownership conversation. And then Adam, maybe close out with you around, I think we all agree like worker voice and worker perspective is critically important in all of this. But what does it look like when that's done well? Like how should organizations think about having those conversations and engaging communities in a real, meaningful, and substantive way? So I'll turn to you at the end for that, but Renise and Evan, maybe you want to share a few final thoughts on kind of this question of business engagement.
I'm happy to start. At the state level, there's lots of employers to think about. And so sometimes, especially early on in this conversation, found myself talking about employers as a monolith, as though they were just like one body of people with similar interests. And it's just important to keep in mind that context matters. And many of the same things that work for how we engage other individuals are also helpful for employers as well. So really starting with a place of listening to understand what is on the plate of the business leader that you're engaging with, what are the challenges that that person is facing, and really helping them to see how job quality can help to address those things that are top of mind. But also, I think helping them to see themselves in the context of that bigger picture. For so many of our businesses in Colorado, they are small businesses. There are folks that are head down working on their business every day. And so I think finding really easy, simple ways that people can get started, businesses can get started to shift job quality dynamics within their firm has been really important. And once you get started, that can open up the door to going deeper and thinking more innovatively about what that looks like. But I would just say, keep it simple, listen to understand, and find ways to get started wherever people are at.
That's great. I think we try to say the same thing in terms of trying to meet people where they're at and recognizing that for many businesses, this is a journey, right? And getting started on the journey is the important piece, not necessarily reaching the destination right away, right? Evan?
Yes, we understand that our work largely begins with the engagement of the business owner. And so there's that tension insofar as, we need to engage that particular person in order to, or shareholders of business in order to facilitate a transaction. And that means we don't necessarily have real visibility of the workforce that we're going to be engaging at the point that we start the process. Um, One thing that we've understood as we move into engaging with workforces is that it's really important that workers see themselves as owners. And one of the things that we've observed is that unfortunately, many workers carry a self-bias that they can't or shouldn't be owners. So relatively early in our engagement with the business, once the legacy owner has decided to move forward, our team engages in some initial group work with a transition group within the workforce to really start to build the ownership culture. That's where that work commences. And it embodies any one of a number of technical aspects, but also quite frankly, a lot of work on having folks sort of reimagine themselves. And I think as part of this work, if we're going to create successful employee ownership in owned companies, particularly those where uh, workers have voice, where workers are participants in governance, that the work of employee ownership culture is really important. And then another piece that we engage at Project Equity is a program called Thrive, where we actually stay with the business for 2 years after it's transitioned. And we spend a lot of time with workers teaching them how to read balance sheets and income statements and, other things that otherwise seem mundane, but for them the light goes on. And, some of the power is instilled in them from having that knowledge. So, a lesson learned for us is that it's one thing to transition a business, it's another to make it truly employee owned. And that is where a lot of that ownership culture work is really important for it to, for us to engage it, for that to happen.
Thanks, Evan. Adam, I'll give you the last word.
Well, I'd say it's all about investing in worker leadership, right? And you mentioned the importance of worker voices, and Matt, you referenced the book that talked about investing in workers as an asset to be maximized. And I think similarly for us, the through line from a small workplace campaign, like the factory union campaign I mentioned, to a fuller blown legislative campaign around job quality issues. It really is about worker leadership. And I think there's very important, compelling research and data that make such strong arguments for some of these job quality concepts and new policy ideas. But I think that it's really with workers' voices and leadership that often can be a critical ingredient to achieve those. And so our domestic worker members who took buses to the Capitol in Illinois back in 2016 really helped propel the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. We're gearing up looking at extreme temperature safety legislation in the state of Illinois, as that's something that we hear increasingly from workers as important. There's such a plethora of data and research available suggesting that regulating workplace temperatures is really a common sense job quality issue. And yet I think it's going to have to be, sadly, some of the horror stories that our members have experienced, like our members at a tortilla factory locally who did not always have heat during Chicago winter, the last Chicago winter, making tortillas for the entire Midwest. So I think that really that's what it comes down to for us, is investing in workers to be in a position of leadership to really propel these conversations forward, especially on these big concepts.
I think that's a great message to end on. Well, thank you, Evan, Renise, Adam, for being here today and sharing your perspective and expertise and all the great work you all are doing. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to my colleagues, Merritt, Maxwell, Finney, and Maureen, for their work on this new report. I hope you all will check it out, give us any feedback or thoughts on it. If there are other events like this that you have ideas around of other issues related to this job quality conversation or other practices that you would like to see a webinar around, please stick around and complete that survey and let us know that. Thanks to Tony, Nora, and Francis on our communications team for all their support, both on the report and this event. We have a couple events coming up here in the next month or so. So next Wednesday on July 30th, we have an event called Feeling the Heat, Workplace Safety in a Warming World, as we take a look at the increasing safety issues and often deadly issues of working in extreme temperatures. And then on September 4th, right after Labor Day, we have an all-star lineup for a conversation on the future of equal opportunity. We hope to see you all there. Thanks once again for joining us today, and please stay in touch.